"Why does my daughter's lemonade stand need a permit in our own front yard?" I asked, holding the bright yellow citation in my hand like it was some kind of bad joke. The orange envelope felt heavier than it should, as if it carried more than just a fine. It carried the weight of an entire neighborhood's suffocating rules and the quiet war that was about to begin. "My name's Emma Grant. I'm a graphic designer, a mother, and for better or worse, a homeowner in Willow Creek. Our little community is the kind of place where everybody knows your name, your business, and apparently your kids' entrepreneurial dreams. I'm here today because this isn't just about a lemonade stand. It's about standing up when the people in power decide to make your life harder for no good reason. Before I dive deeper, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments, and if you want to hear how one mom took on the neighborhood bullies and won, make sure to hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Willow Creek is more than just a cluster of homes, it's a patchwork of memories. For me, every corner holds a story, especially the old oak tree at the edge of our yard. That tree isn't just any tree. My father planted it the day I was born, digging his hands into the soil with a grin that never faded. It stood as a silent guardian over our family's legacy, a place where my daughter Lily first took her shaky steps, and where I, years ago, sat for hours with my mother, sharing stories as the sun dipped below the horizon. But over the years, that tree came to symbolize something else: resistance. The oak weathered storms, just like we would have to weather this looming conflict with our HOA. Because what started with a simple fine soon began to feel like a personal attack, a slow tightening noose wrapped around everything we cherished. It all began innocuously enough. Lily, just 8 years old, set up a lemonade stand on a sunny Saturday afternoon. Nothing fancy, just a small folding table, a hand-painted sign, and a smile as bright as the summer sky. She was trying to raise money for a new bike, and I was proud of her for being so resourceful. That's when the first warning arrived. A polite note slipped under our door, citing unpermitted commercial activity. I thought it was a mistake. Then came the official fine. The HOA President, Veronica Stone, a woman with a sharp eye for rules and an even sharper tongue, made it clear this neighborhood ran like clockwork and no exceptions were allowed. Her idea of community was control, and any deviation, no matter how small or innocent, was a threat. I wasn't the kind to back down. Losing my father a few years ago reminded me how fleeting time is and how precious the things we inherit can be, not just property, but respect, dignity, and the freedom to live without fear of arbitrary punishment. This neighborhood, this house, and that oak tree weren't just places, they were legacies that deserved protection. It didn't take long for the small fines to multiply. First it was the lemonade stand, then the colorful flower pots I placed by the porch were unsanctioned decorations. The garden gnome I inherited from my grandmother was suddenly an eyesore. Even my car got a citation for improper parking, though it was always in the same spot for years. Each fine felt less like a warning and more like a message. We control this neighborhood, and you will fall in line. But I'm not the type to accept unjust rules quietly. The fight was just beginning, and I knew it would demand more than a few angry phone calls or polite letters. It would take grit, strategy, and a willingness to stand firm, not just for me, but for Lily and every family who deserved a voice. As I stand here today, staring at that first citation, I realize this isn't just about fines or rules. It's about reclaiming our community, preserving our legacy, and proving that sometimes, even one person can change the course of an entire neighborhood. The oak tree in our yard is a reminder. It survived harsh winters and blazing summers, just as we will survive this fight, and if I have to, I'll take on the entire HOA to protect what's ours. The weight of that first fine hung heavy in the air, but what came next made it clear this wasn't going to be a one-off misunderstanding. The HOA's grip tightened like a vice, wrapping itself around every corner of our lives. They weren't just enforcing rules, they were asserting power, and I could feel the neighborhood's pulse quicken with each petty demand. I remember the afternoon I found another note taped to our front door, this time about my flower pots. Unsanctioned decorations, it said, with that cold official stamp that left no room for discussion. The irony? Those flowers had been planted by my mother years ago, a gift she left behind when she passed. I traced my fingers over the faded petals, as if to hold on to her memory a little longer. It wasn't just dirt and blooms, it was history. At the next HOA meeting, I showed up determined to speak, but Veronica Stone's steely glare cut through the room. The board was a well-oiled machine, led by her sharp tongue and sharper rules. She stood behind her podium like a queen, defending her throne, dismissing anyone who dared question her authority. "We're here to maintain standards," she said, voice dripping with condescension, "and no exceptions." I watched as neighbors shifted uneasily, some nodding in agreement, others biting their lips. The air was thick with tension, but no one dared to challenge Veronica directly. I felt their silent fear, the kind that comes from years of being pushed down and told to stay quiet. One elderly woman caught my eye. Mrs. Jenkins, who had lived here since the neighborhood was first built, looked worn and wary. Her hands trembled as she clutched a faded photo of the community's founding picnic. I could see the years of loyalty battling with the growing unease. She gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod, an unspoken gesture of support perhaps, or a plea for change. That night, I sat with Lily in the kitchen, trying to explain why the neighborhood that felt like home suddenly seemed so hostile. "Mom, why can't I sell lemonade?" she asked, her voice a mix of confusion and hurt. Her innocence made the fight feel even more urgent. This wasn't just about rules anymore. It was about protecting the freedom to be a kid, to dream, to create. I called my sister that evening, needing advice. "You have to stand your ground," she said firmly. "This isn't just about a lemonade stand. It's about who gets to decide what kind of community you want." Her words echoed my own growing conviction. But standing ground meant more than stubbornness. It required strategy. I started keeping detailed records, photos of my garden, copies of every note in fine, names and dates of every conversation. I reached out quietly to a few neighbors, gauging their thoughts. Some were cautious, worried about stirring trouble. Others shared their own stories of small but persistent harassment, fines for holiday lights, complaints about noise, absurd demands that no one seemed able to escape. The community was fracturing beneath the surface, polite smiles hiding simmering resentment. I realized I wasn't alone in this, and that gave me a sliver of hope. Days turned into weeks, and the fines kept coming. A citation for an improperly trimmed hedge showed up like clockwork, even though I hadn't touched it since spring. Another, for unauthorized use of property, appeared after I hosted a small neighborhood barbecue to try and bring people together. Veronica seemed determined to squash any sign of resistance. One afternoon, I caught her talking with a few board members by the community mailbox. Her words were low but fierce, dripping with control. "We can't let them think they're above the rules," she said, voice sharp as glass. "If we let this slide, next thing you know, everyone will want special treatment." I felt a fire ignite inside me. This wasn't about order, it was about power, and I wasn't going to let it win. That night, I looked out at the old oak tree, its branches heavy with leaves whispering in the breeze. It had weathered storms and seasons far worse than this, and so would we. This tree was more than a symbol. It was a promise that no matter how hard they pushed, we would stand firm. I wasn't sure how this fight would end, but I knew one thing for certain. I wouldn't let my family's legacy or this community's spirit be crushed under the weight of petty authority. The days after that tense conversation under the oak tree were filled with quiet observation. I kept a closer eye on the neighborhood, not just the obvious battles with the HOA, but the subtle undercurrents that shaped our community. That's when I noticed Tom. Tom Patterson was one of those neighbors you'd overlook if you blinked. Mid-40s, a soft-spoken accountant who'd lived here for years. He was a regular at HOA meetings, often sitting quietly in the corner with his notebook, rarely speaking but always watching. His presence was unassuming, almost invisible, yet as the tension between me and Veronica grew, Tom's behavior shifted in ways I couldn't ignore. At the last HOA meeting, I caught him glancing my way more than once. His hands twitched nervously on the table, fingers drumming a silent beat. When Veronica barked at me for disrupting the community's peace, Tom's eyes flickered with something... discomfort? Doubt? I wasn't sure yet, but it was a crack in the facade of the board's iron grip. That evening, I ran into Tom at the community park. The setting sun cast long shadows over the swings and benches, a place where neighbors often gathered for small talks and evening strolls. He hesitated when I approached, then offered a quiet nod. "I've been watching," he said low, voice barely above the rustling leaves. "Things aren't right, Emma. I see what they're doing. It's too much." His confession felt like a breath of fresh air, but I also sensed the weight it carried. Tom was caught between loyalty to the HOA and his growing discomfort with its overreach. "I want to help," he added, "but it's not that simple. There are things you don't know, things that make it risky for me to speak out." I nodded, understanding the delicate line he was walking. His silence wasn't from apathy, it was fear, and maybe a flicker of hope that change was still possible. From that day, Tom became a silent ally. He didn't speak publicly, but started slipping me small pieces of information. Meeting notes, board emails, even whispers about underhanded dealings with contractors hired by Veronica. His trembling hands as he handed me the documents told me everything. At the same time, I noticed the neighborhood fracturing more visibly. Friendly greetings turned into wary glances. Some neighbors avoided eye contact while others whispered behind closed doors. The community that once felt like a warm blanket was becoming a cold battlefield. One afternoon, while watering the flowers my mother had planted, Mrs. Jenkins stopped by. Her usual cheerful smile was replaced by a weary sigh. "I've seen this neighborhood change," she said softly, eyes fixed on the garden gnome I refused to hide. "When my husband and I built this place, it was about neighbors helping neighbors, not this." Her words struck a chord. This wasn't just a fight over fines and rules, it was a battle for the soul of Willow Creek. I shared my growing alliance with Tom and my fears for the community. Mrs. Jenkins nodded slowly, then said something I hadn't expected. "Sometimes it takes just one person willing to stand up before others find the courage." Her words stayed with me as the days rolled on. The stakes were rising, and my fight was no longer just about my family. It was about everyone who called this place home. But with every small victory, Veronica's retaliation grew harsher. The fines escalated to ridiculous levels, and the board started targeting others who dared to show support. A young couple down the street received a notice for a non-compliant mailbox. A single mother was warned about excessive noise after a birthday party. The message was clear: dissent would not be tolerated. Through it all, Tom remained my quiet confidant, his conflicted presence a reminder that even in darkness, there were cracks waiting to be widened. One evening, as the neighborhood settled into uneasy silence, Tom handed me a folded note with trembling fingers. "This might help," he whispered before disappearing into the shadows. The note was simple but loaded with implication, a cryptic reference to past HOA meetings and unexplained expenditures. It was the first real clue that the problems ran deeper than I imagined. The battle was far from over, but now I wasn't fighting blind. There were allies in unexpected places, and for the first time, a plan was beginning to take shape. If you're following this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss how this fight unfolds, because sometimes standing up to the powers that be starts with just one voice. The note Tom slipped me that evening was more than just a piece of paper. It was a spark in the dark. But knowing something was wrong and proving it were two different battles. I had to tread carefully. Every step I took from that moment forward was measured, calculated. I started by going through the little things I'd dismissed before: the strange timing of fines, the odd contractors popping up around the neighborhood, the rushed board meetings with little transparency. Something was off. The more I looked, the more it became clear Veronica and her allies weren't just strict. They were manipulating rules to tighten their grip, turning neighbors into prisoners of petty regulations. One morning, as I watered the small flower bed by the porch, the same spot where my mother's favorite rose bush once bloomed, I noticed a familiar face watching from across the street. It was Mark, the quiet man from 2 houses down. He rarely spoke at meetings, but his eyes held stories of frustration. He'd been an early supporter of Veronica, but lately kept his distance, like he was reconsidering everything. "Looks like you're digging deeper than most," he said when I walked over, nodding toward the note I held loosely in my hand. Mark's voice was low but steady, carrying the weight of someone used to keeping secrets. "Too deep?" I asked, eyes narrowing. "Let's just say, I've seen what happens to those who ask too many questions here," he replied, glancing toward the HOA office, where Veronica's name was etched on the door like a warning. It was a moment heavy with unspoken threats, but also a flicker of alliance. Mark wasn't ready to join the fight openly, but his caution spoke volumes. I realized this was about more than just me and Lily. It was about an entire neighborhood being held hostage by fear. The days that followed were a whirlwind of subtle defiance. I started sharing discreet messages with Tom and Mark, piecing together a timeline of violations, fines, and odd financial dealings. Each discovery added another brick to the wall we were building against the HOA's unchecked power. Meanwhile, Veronica doubled down. The fine for my unauthorized garden decorations came with a letter so heavy with legal jargon it felt designed to intimidate rather than inform. She wasn't just enforcing rules anymore, she was sending a message. At a neighborhood barbecue I organized to bring people together, hoping to remind everyone what community meant. A few board members showed up uninvited. Their smiles were tight, their eyes scanning for any sign of dissent. When Lily set up a fresh lemonade stand, they quickly flagged it down, threatening more fines. Watching Veronica's allies swoop in like vultures ignited something fierce inside me. This wasn't just about rules or property lines, it was about silencing voices, stamping out the very spirit of the neighborhood. That night, as the barbecue faded and the streetlights flickered on, I sat under the oak tree, the old branches whispering in the warm breeze. The tree still stood strong, a silent witness to decades of family memories and neighborhood gatherings. It was my anchor amid the chaos, a reminder that roots run deep. Despite the pressure, I refused to back down. Every letter, every fine, every cold look only fueled my resolve. The fight was no longer a question of if, but how. Then, just when I thought the pressure couldn't get any worse, I found my driveway blocked by a brand new, shiny sign. Unauthorized parking, towed at owner's expense. My heart sank. It was a blatant power play, a warning that the HOA had the means to make life miserable for anyone who stepped out of line. I called the towing company, only to be told the order came directly from the HOA board. No discussion, no warning, just immediate action. The message was clear: dissent would be crushed, and the tools of intimidation were ready and waiting. But here's the thing about power: it's only as strong as those who wield it, and as weak as those who fear to challenge it. That night, under the sprawling limbs of my father's oak tree, I made a promise. If they wanted a fight, they would get one, and I wasn't going to fight alone. The towing of my car was a sharp wake-up call, a blatant escalation in Veronica's campaign against me. That night, as the streetlights cast long shadows over the quiet neighborhood, I sat staring at the oak tree in my yard. Its silhouette felt heavier somehow, as if carrying the weight of every struggle this family had ever faced. I knew I couldn't just react anymore. I had to get proactive. The very next day I returned to the basement, the one room in the house I had always avoided. It was dark, dusty, and filled with forgotten relics of our family's past. Boxes stacked high, old furniture draped in sheets, and countless memories hidden in the clutter. The basement was like a time capsule, untouched since my father's passing. With only a flashlight and determination, I started rummaging through the boxes. The air was thick with the smell of aged paper and musty wood. The floorboards creaked under my feet, each step echoing like a secret being uncovered. I pulled out a battered, leather-bound notebook that once belonged to my father, his meticulous handwriting tracing back years of HOA meeting notes and neighborhood records. My fingers trembled as I flipped through pages filled with names, dates, and financial details. It wasn't just garden club minutes or potluck schedules. There were records that hinted at questionable dealings, payments to contractors that no one seemed to remember, decisions made behind closed doors, and rules that had suddenly become more restrictive after a certain date. Faint sounds from upstairs, the distant bark of a dog, a car door closing, grounded me as I sifted through another box. Inside were old letters between neighbors, complaints that had been ignored, and faded photographs of community events from decades ago. Among them, I found a handwritten map sketched by my father marking the exact spot where the oak tree stood, a symbol of his hope for a neighborhood built on trust. As I traced the lines of that map, a sharp noise startled me. The basement light flickered violently. For a moment, the shadows danced and the silence thickened. I caught my breath and reminded myself this was more than a basement or a tree. It was the foundation of everything I was fighting for. Later, over coffee with Tom and Mark, I laid out what I'd found. Their faces mirrored my mix of excitement and caution. Tom's usually calm demeanor cracked as he admitted, "This is the proof we needed, Emma, but if Veronica finds out we have this, it could get ugly." Mark nodded. "We have to be smart. This isn't just a neighborhood dispute anymore. It's a battle against people who play dirty. We agreed to keep the findings secret, sharing only with a handful of trusted neighbors. The basement discovery gave us a new weapon, solid evidence that Veronica and her board weren't just strict enforcers. They were abusing their power for personal gain. The following week, I noticed subtle shifts in the neighborhood. More eyes lingered when I walked by. Some neighbors offered quiet nods of support, while others kept their distance, wary of retaliation. The air was thick with anticipation, but also fear. One afternoon, I overheard Veronica on a phone call, her voice sharp as ice. "Keep an eye on Grant," she said. "If she thinks she's digging into the past, she doesn't know what she's stirring." That moment crystallized everything. The fight wasn't just about me or Lily anymore. It was about exposing corruption that had quietly poisoned our community. But Veronica wasn't just any opponent. She was cunning and ruthless. Back in my kitchen, with Lily's drawings spread out on the table, I thought about how far we'd come. From a simple lemonade stand to uncovering a web of deceit. The oak tree outside the window seemed to whisper encouragement, its branches steady against the evening sky. I was ready to face whatever came next. With evidence in hand and allies by my side, the slow march toward justice had begun. The neighborhood wasn't just a place anymore, it was a cause worth fighting for. The weight of what I'd uncovered in the basement lingered in my mind like a low hum, unseen but impossible to ignore. Every night, as the house grew quiet and the moonlight filtered through the window, I found myself drawn back to that old oak tree, its rough bark comforting presence beneath my fingertips. It wasn't just a tree anymore. It was a symbol of family, truth, and the battle ahead. The days following our discovery were a whirlwind of hushed meetings and careful planning. Tom and Mark became my most trusted confidants, each bringing something different to the table. Tom's attention to detail was unmatched. He meticulously combed through the HOA's financial disclosures and meeting minutes I had found, highlighting inconsistencies and unexplained expenses. Mark, with his calm pragmatism, helped me navigate the delicate social dynamics of our fractured neighborhood. One afternoon, Tom and I sat at my kitchen table, papers spread around us like a puzzle waiting to be solved. "Look at this," he said, tapping a line item in a spreadsheet. "Payments to Green Solutions tripled last year, but no one remembers any projects or bids." His finger hovered over the numbers as if they might suddenly explain themselves. "I checked," I replied. "No record of any work done, no neighborhood updates, nothing." The more we uncovered, the clearer the picture became. The HOA board was funneling money through shadowy contractors, probably connected to Veronica or her inner circle. It was corruption wrapped in the guise of community upkeep. Meanwhile, the neighborhood's mood shifted subtly. I noticed more people watching, more cautious greetings, fewer smiles. But beneath the surface, there was a quiet swell of support. A few neighbors slipped me handwritten notes, offering small bits of information or encouragement. The fear was still there, but hope was starting to poke through. One evening, I decided to visit Mrs. Jenkins. She welcomed me with a warm but tired smile, her kitchen smelling of fresh-baked bread and memories. We sat by the window overlooking the oak tree, its branches swaying gently in the breeze. "You've stirred things up, Emma," she said softly, folding her hands in her lap. "But sometimes it takes a storm to clear the air." I smiled, grateful for her quiet wisdom. "I just want to protect what my family built and what this neighborhood could be." She nodded. "Your father would be proud." That night, Lily asked if she could set up her lemonade stand again. "Just for fun," she said, eyes hopeful but wary. It was a small act of defiance, but in that moment, it felt monumental. I agreed, reminding her to keep it simple and safe. The stand was modest, just a folding table and a handmade sign, but it felt like a beacon of normalcy in the growing chaos. The next morning, I woke to find a note taped to the stand. Unauthorized commercial activity, immediate removal required. But this time, instead of anger, I felt resolve. I took a photo, logged the incident, and shared it with Tom and Mark. Our strategy was evolving. We weren't just reacting, we were documenting, building a case. We reached out quietly to a legal expert who specialized in HOA disputes. Her advice was clear, evidence was power, and we needed to present an undeniable trail of abuse. That same day, Tom brought over a USB drive. "I hacked together what I could find from public records," he said with a sheepish grin. "Not exactly James Bond stuff, but it's something." We spent hours poring over files, contracts, emails, budget sheets, all pointing to a pattern of misconduct. Veronica's empire was built on secrecy, and we were slowly unraveling it. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the yard, I stood by the oak tree once more. The leaves rustled softly, a whisper of encouragement. This fight was far from over, but now, armed with truth and allies, I felt ready to face whatever came next. If you're still with me, drop a comment telling me what part of this story hits home for you. And don't forget to subscribe, because the next chapters reveal how we turned these discoveries into real action, and you won't want to miss it. Armed with the evidence Tom had compiled and the legal advice from our attorney, the fight was shifting gears. No longer was this just a personal vendetta, it was a calculated campaign. But strategy meant patience, and patience meant sitting through long, grueling HOA meetings armed with quiet determination. Our first move was subtle, recording. At the next board meeting, I arrived early with my phone, discreetly set to record. Veronica and her allies were already there, rehearsing their rehearsed lines, eyes sharp, smiles brittle. I caught Tom's gaze across the room, a silent nod of reassurance. We were in this together. The meeting began with the usual formalities, but I noticed a shift in Veronica's tone. She was defensive, even nervous. Her usual confidence was punctuated by sharp glances toward me. I stayed calm, asking pointed questions about the financial inconsistencies I'd uncovered. My voice didn't waver as I laid out the timeline, backed by documents and the basement notes. I saw her stiffen, a flicker of panic betraying her controlled exterior. Behind me, murmurs rippled through the crowd. Neighbors who had once hidden behind polite smiles now leaned forward, their curiosity piqued, when I played a recorded snippet of a previous private meeting where Veronica threatened dissenters. The room fell into stunned silence. After the meeting, several neighbors approached me quietly, sharing their own stories of fines and intimidation. What had been isolated complaints now formed a chorus, and the HOA's mask was slipping. Tom and Mark were instrumental, gathering witness statements and cross-referencing dates. Mark's knack for detail helped us identify loopholes in the HOA's procedures, missing signatures, improper notice timings, and rules applied inconsistently. Each discovery was a blow to Veronica's carefully constructed empire. Yet, despite the momentum, the battle was far from over. Veronica retaliated with a wave of new, more restrictive rules. Bans on yard sales, curfews on children playing outside, and tight limits on what could be displayed on porches. It was a blatant attempt to crush any hope of rebellion. But this time, we were ready. With our growing coalition, we organized a community meeting to discuss a collective response. The gymnasium buzzed with nervous energy as families and seniors, kids and retirees came together. Lily stood by my side, her lemonade stand set up once again, not for profit, but as a symbol of resilience. I spoke to the crowd not as a lone fighter, but as a voice for all who felt powerless. We're not just protecting our homes, I told them. We're protecting our rights, our dignity, and the spirit of this community. The room erupted in applause, hope finally breaking through the fear. As plans took shape, petitions, legal filings, and public forums, I felt the old oak tree's presence with me, steady and unyielding. It was more than a symbol now, it was a rallying point. One evening, as the neighborhood settled, Tom handed me an envelope. Inside was a recording of a board meeting I hadn't known about, one where Veronica discussed silencing critics and controlling finances for personal gain. His hands trembled as he explained how risky it had been to get this. The gravity of that moment hit me hard. We had the proof, the voices, and the plan. The next steps would be the hardest, but this was our turning point. Under the oak's sprawling branches, I looked toward the future with resolve. The fight was far from over, but the tide was turning. Together, we would reclaim Willow Creek. The energy from our community meeting lingered in the air like electricity. For the first time in months, I felt the swell of something bigger than just me and my family. A neighborhood waking up. The quiet whispers of frustration were turning into voices ready to be heard. That weekend, Lily and I set up her lemonade stand, again, this time right by the community park. It wasn't about selling cups of lemonade anymore. It was a beacon of defiance, a rallying cry. Kids gathered around, their laughter piercing the usual tension that hung over Willow Creek like a heavy fog. I watched families exchange hopeful glances, their walls of fear cracking just enough to let in a glimmer of trust. Meanwhile, Tom and Mark continued their work behind the scenes. Tom, ever the meticulous planner, was drafting letters to local newspapers and city council members, highlighting the HOA's misuse of power. Mark organized informal gatherings, small pockets of resistance where neighbors could share their stories without fear of retribution. At one such gathering, I met Sarah, a young mother who had been quietly fighting her own battle. Her mailbox was repeatedly vandalized, and the HOA claimed she violated landscaping rules. But Sarah's courage was infectious, and her story added a fresh layer to our growing movement. "It's like they want to control every inch of our lives," she told me, her eyes fierce with determination. "But together, we're stronger than their rules." That night, as I sat on my porch beneath the oak tree, I reflected on how far we'd come. The branches swayed gently, as if nodding in approval. This tree, a silent witness to generations, had become our symbol of resilience. But with every small victory came renewed pushback. Veronica's faction doubled down on surveillance, installing security cameras at key points around the neighborhood and increasing patrols. Flyers warning about unauthorized gatherings appeared on doorsteps, a thinly veiled threat to anyone involved in our movement. It was clear they were trying to intimidate us into silence, but fear had lost its grip. Each new tactic only strengthened our resolve. The next HOA meeting was a turning point. With evidence in hand and the backing of a growing coalition, I requested a formal agenda item to address the financial discrepancies and overreach. Veronica's usual composure faltered under the weight of community scrutiny. When I presented the compiled documents, contracts, payment records, and the recordings Tom had secured, the room fell into a hush. Some board members shifted uncomfortably, others shot angry glances, but no one could deny the facts. After the meeting, Veronica cornered me in the parking lot, her voice low but venomous. "You think you're clever, don't you?" she sneered. "This neighborhood runs on order. You're stirring chaos." I met her gaze steadily. "This neighborhood runs on fairness, and that's what we're fighting for." Walking away, I felt the eyes of the community on me, some wary, some hopeful. The fight had entered a new phase. No longer was it a quiet struggle behind closed doors. It was a public battle for the soul of Willow Creek. In the days that followed, more neighbors stepped forward. Stories poured in, fines rescinded, intimidation halted, voices reclaimed. Our movement wasn't just a rebellion, it was a restoration. One afternoon, Lily handed me a drawing she'd made, a sprawling oak tree with roots digging deep and branches reaching high, surrounded by smiling neighbors. It was a simple picture, but to me it captured everything: hope, strength, and unity. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I stood beneath that tree, feeling the weight of generations and the promise of change. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time, I believed we would win, not just for us, but for every family that called this place home. The aftermath of that tense HOA meeting sent ripples through Willow Creek like a stone skipping across a still pond. Veronica's carefully controlled world was cracking, and she wasn't about to go down without a fight. The day after the meeting, I found a thick packet slipped under my door. A barrage of new rules and restrictions, so sweeping they felt designed to suffocate every breath of resistance. No more yard sales, no more gatherings without prior approval, limits on decorations so strict they bordered on absurd. It was a clear message: compliance or chaos. But this time I didn't feel cornered, I felt ready. With Tom and Mark by my side, we meticulously dissected the new regulations. Each clause was a trap, but also an opportunity. We uncovered procedural errors, rules implemented without proper notice, contradictory language that could be challenged legally. Mark's analytical mind turned every line of the packet into a puzzle piece. "We'll use their own rules against them," he said, a sly smile breaking through the tension. Meanwhile, the neighborhood atmosphere thickened. Some neighbors withdrew further, intimidated by the tightening grip. Others, inspired by our resolve, stepped forward quietly, sharing stories of fines, threats, and unexplained penalties. The community's undercurrent of fear was slowly transforming into a current of defiance. At a small gathering at my house, Sarah shared her latest ordeal, a warning for excessive noise during her son's birthday party, a claim that felt absurd to anyone who'd been there. Her frustration was palpable, but so was her determination. "They're trying to break us down one by one," she said, "but together we're stronger." That spirit galvanized us. We began organizing workshops on tenant rights and HOA laws, inviting local legal experts to guide us. These meetings were low-key but powerful, neighbors exchanging knowledge and stories, turning fear into empowerment. One evening, as the sun dipped low, I received an anonymous tip, a detailed report on irregularities in the HOA's financial records, including unexplained transfers and conflicts of interest. It was the kind of smoking gun we needed, and it came from a voice within the HOA itself. Tom's hands shook as he reviewed the documents. "This could bring them down," he whispered, his usual calm giving way to excitement. "But we have to move carefully. This isn't just a fight for property lines, it's a fight for justice." The weeks that followed were a balancing act. We filed formal complaints, responded to threats, and prepared for the legal battles ahead. Veronica's retaliation took many forms, from surprise inspections to intimidation tactics, but each time we met them with preparation and unity. One night, after a particularly aggressive confrontation with the board's enforcers, I found myself standing beneath the oak tree, its silhouette strong against the dark sky. The leaves rustled softly, a reminder that roots run deep and that strength often lies in endurance. In the quiet moments between battles, Lily's laughter echoed through the house, a beacon of normalcy amid chaos. Her lemonade stand, now a symbol of our resilience, stood proudly in the yard. The fight was far from over, but with every challenge our resolve hardened. Willow Creek wasn't just a neighborhood anymore, it was a movement. If this story is resonating with you, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe, because next up is the moment we finally confront the truth head on, and you won't want to miss how it all unfolds. The anonymous tip had shifted the entire battle. With the detailed report on the HOA's financial misconduct now in our hands, the stakes suddenly felt much higher. It wasn't just a neighborhood squabble anymore. It was a fight for justice, and the truth was about to come to light. Tom arrived early that morning, eyes sharp but his hands trembling slightly as he passed me a USB drive. "I managed to extract recordings from a backup no one knew existed," he said quietly. "There's a board meeting where Veronica talks openly about silencing anyone who challenges her and how they're funneling funds through shell companies." We gathered in the kitchen, the sunlight filtering softly through the window. My heart pounded as we listened to the recording. Veronica's voice, usually so composed, was raw and menacing. "We can't let them think they have power here," she said coldly. "Every complaint needs to be crushed before it spreads." That kind of admission was the kind of evidence that could topple an empire. But it also painted a target on our backs. We knew the retaliation would be fierce. That afternoon, Sarah stopped by with a wary look. "I heard Veronica's planning a special meeting, something big." Her voice was low, cautious. "They're desperate." We prepared quickly, gathering neighbors who had voiced concerns, ready to confront the board with our findings. The community was nervous, but the courage to stand together outweighed the fear. The special meeting was held in the old community hall, packed beyond capacity. The air was thick with anticipation, whispered conversations, and the quiet hum of determination. Veronica arrived with her usual entourage, faces hard and eyes scanning the crowd like hunters. When it was my turn to speak, I felt the weight of the room, the eyes of neighbors who had suffered quietly for too long. I stood tall, steadying my voice. "We have uncovered evidence that the HOA board has repeatedly abused their power, mismanaging funds, intimidating residents, and suppressing any dissent." I held up the USB drive. "This recording exposes a culture of fear, and it's time for transparency." Veronica's face tightened, but she tried to dismiss it as a smear campaign. "These accusations are baseless," she said sharply. "We act in the community's best interest." But then Tom played the recording. Veronica's voice echoed through the hall, her words undeniable. A stunned silence followed, broken only by whispered gasps. Neighbors exchanged looks, the veil of fear lifting as the truth settled in. Some board members shifted uncomfortably, others avoided eye contact. Veronica's grip on power was slipping. After the meeting, a heated debate ensued, with calls for a full investigation and new leadership. Several board members quietly distanced themselves from Veronica, sensing the tide turning. In the days that followed, petitions circulated and more residents stepped forward with their stories. The sense of community that had been fractured was slowly knitting itself back together. One afternoon, Mrs. Jenkins stopped by my porch, her eyes moist but shining with pride. "You've done more than fight fines, Emma. You've brought this neighborhood back to life." I looked out at the oak tree, its branches catching the sunlight like a beacon. That tree had witnessed decades of family memories, silent struggles, and now a new chapter. The battle was far from over, but the truth had found its voice, and with it came hope. The day of reckoning arrived, quietly but carried the weight of a storm. The community center, usually a place for light-hearted gatherings and potlucks, had transformed into the arena where justice would be laid bare. Rows of folding chairs filled with neighbors, some clutching petitions, others just hoping for change. I sat near the front, the USB drive tucked safely in my bag, its contents having already set wheels in motion. Veronica entered last, her posture rigid, eyes scanning the crowd like a general preparing for battle. Her usual confident smile was absent, replaced by a tightness that betrayed the pressure closing in. The board meeting was open to the public now, and every word would be under scrutiny. I was called to speak first. Standing before the crowd, I felt the presence of every family that had been intimidated, fined, or silenced. The old oak tree, symbol of our legacy, lingered in my mind as a steadying force. "Today isn't just about exposing wrongdoing," I began, voice steady. "It's about reclaiming our community's spirit and fairness. For too long, the HOA's power has been used to divide and suppress, but we are here to change that." I laid out the evidence, financial documents, recordings, testimonials. As I spoke, I noticed neighbors nodding, faces softening from skepticism to belief. The weight of truth was undeniable. When the recording played, Veronica's expression faltered. The room fell into a hush so deep it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. Her cold words, stripped of pretense, echoed off the walls. The first to break the silence was Mrs. Jenkins. Her voice, though frail, carried the strength of decades in this neighborhood. "We trusted these people to protect us. Instead, they betrayed that trust." Others joined in, sharing brief stories, like Sarah, who recounted the unfair fines on her family's celebrations, or Mark, who spoke of intimidation tactics. The collective testimony transformed the gathering, from accusation into a movement. Veronica tried to defend herself, her tone sharp but cracking. "These are baseless allegations, fueled by personal vendettas. The rules exist to protect the community." But the room no longer listened to platitudes. Questions rained down, focused and fierce. Board members who once stood silently now shifted uncomfortably, their loyalty fracturing under scrutiny. In a rare moment, Tom stood up and spoke, his usual reticence replaced by quiet conviction. "This isn't about rules or order, it's about accountability. We owe it to our neighbors to demand transparency." By the end, it was clear the board had lost control. The vote to suspend Veronica and call for an independent investigation passed overwhelmingly. Applause erupted, a release of months of pent-up frustration and hope. Outside, neighbors hugged, shared tears, and for the first time in a long while, smiled freely. The oak tree outside seemed to stand a little taller in the fading light, its branches stretching toward a brighter future. As I walked home, Lily, skipping beside me with her lemonade stand cart in tow, I realized this victory wasn't just mine. It was ours, the neighborhoods, the communities, and most importantly, every voice that refused to be silenced. This was more than a legal win. It was a restoration of dignity, trust, and belonging. And while the path ahead would require healing, the foundation was solid. The dust had barely settled from the community center showdown when I stepped into the new role I hadn't expected to take, the Willow Creek HOA President. It felt surreal, like standing at the edge of a vast forest after a long, grueling climb. The neighborhood's heartbeat was shifting, and I was now the caretaker of its fragile pulse. My first act as president was simple but symbolic, dismantling the oppressive rules that had strangled our community. The bans on lemonade stands, yard sales, and porch decorations were revoked. Neighbors were invited to reclaim their yards, their traditions, their voices. The community that had been silenced for so long was breathing again. But the real victory went beyond policies and bylaws. It was in the quiet moments, the laughter of children playing freely, the shared smiles across freshly painted fences, the return of porch lights twinkling like stars on warm summer nights. The oak tree in my yard, weathered and steadfast, stood witness to this rebirth. Its branches stretched wide as if embracing the neighborhood's renewed spirit. One afternoon, Mrs. Jenkins came by with a basket of homemade cookies. Her eyes, though softened by age, shone with pride. "You didn't just fight for rules," she said, placing the basket on my porch table. "You fought for our dignity." Lily, ever the spark of hope, set up her lemonade stand once more, not just as a business, but as a symbol of resilience. Neighbors gathered, sharing stories and plans for community events that once again celebrated unity instead of control. In quiet moments, I often found myself at the oak tree, tracing the rough bark with my fingertips. It reminded me of my father's hands, steady, patient, and strong. The tree wasn't just a relic, it was a legacy of endurance, truth, and hope. This journey taught me that justice isn't a moment, but a movement. That standing up isn't always loud or confrontational. It can be steady, strategic, and deeply rooted in love for family and community. As I reflect on everything, I realize that the true power lies not in fines or force, but in the courage to say enough and the wisdom to fight for what's right. If you've faced similar battles or felt powerless against unfair rules, I want to hear your story. Drop a comment below sharing where you're watching from and how you've stood up for your community. You're not alone, and together our voices are stronger.